The sun hung high over Flathead Lake, its light splintering across the water like a shattered mirror. Mark Palmer's pickup truck rumbled down the dirt road, tires kicking up dust that clung to the pines lining his lake cabin's lot. It was his first visit in 6 months, after a long stint in Oregon helping his sister recover from surgery. The cabin wasn't much: 2 bedrooms, a sagging porch, and a boat dock weathered by decades of Montana winters. But it was his. His grandfather's hands had shaped its beams, his father's tools still hung on the pegboard in the shed, and the porch swing, carved with his initials at 12, creaked with memories of lazy summers. This was home, or at least it was supposed to be. Mark slowed as he pulled into the driveway, his eyes narrowing. A man sat on his porch swing, shirtless, flip-flops dangling, sipping iced tea from a glass that looked suspiciously like the one Mark's mother had bought in '95. The stranger was in his 30s, tanned, with a Bluetooth headset blinking in his ear, talking loudly about lakefront potential. Mark's stomach twisted. He cut the engine, stepped out, and let the truck door slam shut, the sound echoing across the quiet lot. "Hey," Mark called, squinting against the noon glare. "Can I help you?" The man didn't flinch. He turned his head slowly, like a cat sizing up a bird, and grinned. "You must be the neighbor. I'm Travis. This is my place now." Mark's blood ran cold, a slow freeze that started in his chest and crept to his fingertips. He took a step forward, boots crunching gravel. "No, sir," he said, voice steady but sharp. "This is my cabin. Been in my family since '82. You better get off that swing before we have a problem." Travis actually chuckled, and stood, stretching like he was waking from a nap. "HOA president told me this place was reassigned, said it was abandoned, unclaimed. My mom handled the paperwork." "Your mom?" Mark repeated, the words heavy as stones. And then it hit him like a hammer to the gut. Travis, son of Karen Dwyer, the HOA president, HOA Karen, the woman who'd turned Lakeview into her personal fiefdom, with her fake smiles and iron grip on every mailbox, shutter, and blade of grass. Karen had given his cabin to her son. Mark's vision blurred, not from the sun but from rage. The swing Travis had been lounging on. His grandfather had built it, sanding the oak until it gleamed. The pines framing the porch, Mark had planted them at 12, his hands caked with dirt, his father clapping him on the shoulder. And now this smug, overgrown surfer boy was claiming it all, like Mark's life. His history didn't exist. He didn't argue, didn't shout. Instead he turned, walked back to his truck, and drove 2 blocks to the edge of the HOA office lot. His hands shook as he dialed a number he hadn't used in years, a fencing supplier in Kalispell. "I need 6-foot steel panels, black industrial grade," he said. "Enough for 2 acres plus an extra quarter-mile run. Can you deliver by 3? 3 hours later, a flatbed truck roared up. 2 workers unloading steel posts and panels that glinted like obsidian in the afternoon light. Mark stood by his cabin, blueprints from the county assessor's office spread across his truck's hood. He'd filed them 2 years ago when the HOA first started sniffing around his property line. The foreman, a grizzled man named Carl, raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this, Palmer? You're not just fencing your lot. You're running it straight to their office." Mark's jaw tightened. "That's the point." By 4:00 p.m., the crew was drilling. The auger chewed into the earth, spitting dirt as steel posts sank deep, each one a silent vow. If Karen wanted to mess with his boundaries, he'd redraw them, right up to her doorstep. The fence line started at his cabin's edge, cut through the access road, and marched toward the HOA office, a squat brick building Karen treated like a throne room. By the time the first post hit her prized tulip bed, she was outside, hands on hips, face red as a July tomato. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, her blazer flapping as she waved her arms. Mark held up the blueprints, calm as a lake before a storm. "Fencing what's mine, Karen. You can't block our headquarters." Her voice cracked, and for a moment Mark saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or the realization she'd underestimated him. "Actually, I can," he said, tapping the county stamped survey. "This land, this road, this whole stretch, it's mine. Reaffirmed 2 weeks ago." Her jaw dropped, but before she could spit another word, the post driver slammed another spike into the ground, the thud shaking the office wall. Karen's tulips were mulch now, and Mark didn't flinch. "You'll regret this, Mr. Palmer," she hissed, storming back inside. Mark leaned against a post, watching her go. "No, Karen," he whispered, "you will. To understand how it came to this, you need to know Mark Palmer. 55, born and raised in Columbia Falls, Montana. He was a retired forester with hands calloused from decades of wielding axes and chainsaws. His father, Henry, bought the lake cabin in '82 with savings from his sawmill job. It wasn't a mansion, just a sturdy A-frame with a tin roof, a stone fireplace, and walls etched with the names of grandkids who'd spent summers carving their initials into the pine. After Henry passed, the cabin became Mark's refuge, a place to escape the noise of the world, to fish, to think, to remember. 2 years ago, when the Lakeview HOA formed to preserve property values, Mark didn't bat an eye. He wasn't against order. Rules kept the lake clean, the docks safe. But then came Karen Dwyer. Think buttocks and bulldozers with a smile that never reached her eyes. She wore blazers to barbecues, carried a clipboard like a scepter, and enforced rules that didn't exist. Quiet hours at 8 p.m., shutters that had to be regulation beige, fines for parking a boat trailer 2 inches too far left. The neighbors grumbled, but most complied, too tired to fight. Mark, he waved politely every time he saw her, believing kindness could soften even the sharpest edges. He was wrong. Last fall, Mark flew to Oregon to care for his sister post-surgery. He was gone 6 months, the cabin locked tight, taxes paid, and his friend Joe checking in weekly. When he returned early this summer, Joe met him at the gas station, beard twitching. "Mark, something's off at your place. Saw a young guy moving furniture in. Thought you rented it out." Mark's gut sank. Never. He drove to the cabin and found Travis, lounging like a king on Mark's swing, claiming the place as his own. And now here Mark stood, watching steel rise like a wall of vengeance, cutting through Karen's fake rules and her tulip beds. The fence wasn't just about his cabin. It was about every neighbor who'd been fined for a birdhouse, every widow bullied over a crooked mailbox. Mark had been kind his whole life, but kindness didn't mean weakness. The quiet ones take notes. The humble ones know exactly where the lines are drawn. As the crew hammered another post, a black SUV rolled up, headlights slicing through the dusk. A man stepped out, tinted glasses, clipboard in hand. He knocked on Mark's truck window. "You Mark Palmer?" Mark nodded, slow. "That's me." The man flipped the clipboard. "I'm here to serve you a cease and desist from the HOA board." "On what grounds?" Mark asked, voice low. Before the man could answer, a shout cut through the air. Travis burst from the cabin, hammer in hand, eyes wild. "You can't take this from me. My mom promised me." His voice cracked, raw, desperate, and in that moment he made a fatal mistake. He admitted in front of the neighborhood that he knew the cabin wasn't his. The man in glasses glanced at Travis, then at Mark, and a smirk flickered across his face. Mark didn't say a word. He rolled up his window, started the engine, and let the moment burn. The fence was up, the lines were drawn, and the war had just begun. The crew worked until sunset, the fence now a black iron spine stretching from Mark's cabin to the HOA office. Neighbors had started to gather, phones out, whispering. Some cheered quietly, others just watched, unsure if they were witnessing justice or madness. Mark didn't care. He sat in his truck, sipping coffee from a thermos, the blueprints folded beside him, the cease, and desist notice lay on the passenger seat, unopened. He'd deal with it later. For now, he watched the last post go in, locking the HOA office in a cage of his own making. Karen hadn't reappeared, but Mark knew she was watching, probably pacing her office, calling her lawyer, her cousin on the county board, anyone who could pull a string. She'd built her empire on intimidation, fines, threats, forged documents. But Mark had something she didn't, the truth, and truth, like a good fence, could hold up against a storm. He thought back to the first time he met Karen, 2 years ago at a community potluck. She'd smiled, offered him a slice of her famous lemon cake, and asked if his cabin's shutters met code. He'd laughed it off, said he'd check, but her eyes, cold as the lake in January, told him she wasn't asking. She was commanding. That was the moment he should have known. Power in the wrong hands doesn't just bend rules, it breaks lives. As the crew packed up, Carl tipped his hat. "You've got balls, Palmer, but you know this ain't over." Mark nodded. Never thought it was. He stayed in the truck that night, parked in the driveway just in case. The cabin felt too vulnerable, too raw, with Travis's footprints still fresh on the porch. Mark dozed fitfully, waking to every rustle of leaves, every creak of the swing. At dawn, he heard it, banging, not gentle, but angry, like fists on metal. He peeked through the truck's blinds. 3 HOA board members stood outside his fence, clipboards in hand, ties flapping, badges clipped to their shirts like they were running a sting operation. "Mr. Palmer," one shouted, a wiry man with a mustache, "you're in violation of obstruction code 4B, subsection 12. Mark stepped out, coffee mug in hand, and raised an eyebrow. "That fence is on my land. I've got the original survey right here." "Not anymore." Another snapped, a woman waving a manila folder. "Karen redrew the lot lines while you were gone. This cabin's registered as Lot 42A under Travis Dwyer." Mark's pulse quickened, but he didn't blink. He'd seen this coming. Karen wasn't just bold, she was reckless. He walked to the lockbox bolted to a fence post, pulled out his certified land survey, stamped and notarized. "This," he said, holding it up, "shows the cabin and 2 acres in my name, reaffirmed by the county 2 weeks ago." The board members froze. The wiry man turned red. The woman flipped through her folder, frowning. Mark waited, letting the silence do the talking. They'd expected him to fold, to apologize, to back down. But Mark had learned something in his years in the woods. A tree doesn't fall if its roots are deep. "We'll see you in court," the wiry man muttered, retreating. Mark watched them go, the survey still in his hand. Court. He'd been ready for that months ago. Before he left for Oregon, strange HOA letters had started arriving. Vague notices about compliance issues and property reassessments. He'd smelled trouble then, updated his title, and filed a quiet title action to lock his ownership in stone. Karen thought she could outmaneuver him, but she'd underestimated a man who'd spent his life reading the land. He drove to town, meeting his friend Rick at the diner. Rick, a lawyer who owed Mark a favor from a timber clearing job years back, was already sipping lemonade when Mark slid into the booth. "You were right," Mark said, tossing the cease and desist notice on the table. Rick opened a folder, his face grim. "They filed a quitclaim deed in your name, forged. Look at this." He slid over a document. Mark's signature was there, but it wasn't his hand. The loops were too tight, the slant wrong. "If we prove Karen did this," Rick said, tapping the paper, "she's looking at felony charges." Mark's stomach churned. Karen hadn't just given his cabin away, she'd faked his signature to do it. "You think she's done this before?" he asked. Rick leaned in. "I'd bet my boots on it." Mark stared out the diner window, the lake shimmering in the distance. He thought of his father's sketches, tucked in a notebook at the cabin, detailing every nail in the place. He thought of the pines he'd planted, now tall enough to shade the porch, and he thought of Travis lounging on that swing, oblivious to the history he was trampling. Karen had built a house of cards, but Mark was about to bring it down. He drove back to the cabin, the fence gleaming under the afternoon sun. Neighbors were still milling about, some snapping photos, others whispering about Karen's meltdown. Mark didn't stop to chat. He went inside, pulled out his father's notebook, and started scanning every page. Sketches, receipts, photos from '82 when the foundation was poured. He made copies, then drove around the lake, dropping them in every neighbor's mailbox with a note. "What would you do if your home was stolen while you were helping family? Next, it could be yours. A neighbor who remembers what this lake stands for." By evening, the neighborhood was buzzing. People talked over fences, on docks, in driveways. Karen's name was poisoned now, her lies exposed. She stood outside the HOA office, screaming about defamation and lies, but no one listened. The tide was turning. Then, as Mark restacked firewood by the cabin, he saw movement by the shoreline. Travis stumbling through the grass, a half-empty bottle in hand. He collapsed onto the swing, muttering to himself. "I didn't know," he slurred. "She said it was a gift, just paperwork." Mark stepped forward, his shadow falling over the younger man. "She lied to you?" Travis looked up, startled, but didn't argue. Mark handed him a glass of water and sat on the steps. "If you really thought this place was yours," Mark said, "you'd have brought your own furniture." Travis gave a bitter chuckle. "Fair." He stared at the bottle, then tossed it into the lake, wiping his eyes. "I'll talk," he said quietly. "Whatever you need, I'll testify." Mark nodded, but his guard stayed up. Travis might have been a pawn, but he'd still sat on that swing. The night closed in, the lake quiet except for the creak of the swing. Mark knew this wasn't over. Karen was cornered, and cornered animals fight dirty, but he was ready, because when you've been kind your whole life, people think you're soft. They forget the quiet ones are the ones who know exactly where to strike. The moon hung low over Flathead Lake, its pale light casting shadows that danced across the water like ghosts. Mark Palmer sat in his truck, parked in the driveway of his lake cabin, the engine long since cooled. The black steel fence he'd erected that afternoon stood tall, its posts glinting under the stars, a silent barrier between his home and the HOA office where Karen Dwyer plotted her next move. The cease and desist notice from the HOA board lay crumpled on the passenger seat, but Mark's mind wasn't on legal threats. It was on Travis, Karen's son, who'd stumbled onto the porch swing hours ago, half drunk and confessing his mother's lies. "I'll testify," he'd said, tossing his bottle into the lake. Mark wanted to believe him, but trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not yet. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching on gravel, and scanned the property. The cabin stood quiet, its windows dark, but the air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. Mark had spent his life reading the woods, knowing when a bear was near, when a fire was about to spark. Tonight, the lake front carried that same restless edge. He checked the lockbox on the fence post, where his certified land survey and blueprints were stored, then walked the perimeter, ensuring every post was secure. The fence wasn't just a boundary, it was a statement. Karen had tried to steal his home, forging deeds to give it to her son. Mark had answered with iron. As he reached the porch, the swing creaked in the breeze, its chains rattling like a warning. He froze, hand on the railing, remembering Travis's smug grin that morning, sipping iced tea like he owned the place. Mark's grandfather had built that swing, carving the oak with a pocket knife, teaching a 12-year-old Mark how to sand it smooth. The memory burned, sharp and raw, and Mark's fists clenched. Karen hadn't just crossed a line, she'd trampled his roots, but roots run deep, and Mark was no stranger to fighting for what was his. He went inside, the cabin's familiar smells, pine, old leather, and faint traces of his father's pipe tobacco, grounding him. He pulled out his father's notebook, a worn leather journal filled with sketches of the cabin's construction, receipts for every nail, and photos of the family on the dock. Mark had scanned these pages earlier, dropping copies in every neighbor's mailbox with a note. What would you do if your home was stolen while you were helping family? Next, it could be yours. The lake community was stirring now, whispers turning to shouts, but Mark knew Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. He sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, uploading the scanned documents to a cloud drive. Every sketch, every receipt, every proof of ownership. Safe, untouchable. He was about to close the laptop when a sharp knock rattled the door. Mark's hand went to the hunting knife on the counter, a reflex from years in the wilderness. He opened the door to find old Joe, his friend who'd kept an eye on the cabin while Mark was in Oregon. Joe's beard was wilder than usual, his eyes darting. "Mark, you need to see this," Joe said, holding out a crumpled envelope. "Found it in my mailbox. Ain't your handwriting?" Mark took it, his pulse quickening. Inside was a single sheet, typed, unsigned. "Back off, Palmer, or your cabin's next." No signature, but the venom was pure Karen. Mark's jaw tightened. "She's desperate," he said, folding the note. "Means we're getting to her." Joe nodded, but his face was grim. "Be careful, Mark. I saw lights near your boathouse an hour ago. Thought it was kids, but now I ain't so sure." Mark's stomach dropped. The boathouse, a rickety structure his father built in '84, held more than fishing gear. It was where Mark kept his dad's World War Roman II medals, a photo of them on the dock, and a tackle box etched with his initials. He grabbed a flashlight and headed out, Joe trailing behind. The night was still, the lake lapping softly, but as they neared the shore, an orange glow flickered through the pines. Mark broke into a run. The boathouse was ablaze. Flames licked the dry boards, the roof already collapsing in a shower of sparks. Mark grabbed a bucket from the dock, filled it with lake water, and threw it at the fire, but it was like spitting on a forest blaze. Neighbors appeared, drawn by the light, shouting for someone to call the fire department. Mark's chest heaved, his eyes locked on the flames devouring his father's handiwork. He saw the photo in his mind, his dad grinning, holding a 5-year-old Mark on his shoulders by that dock. The frame was in there, melting, gone. A firefighter, sweat, streaked and grim, approached Mark as the flames died to embers. He held out a charred metal rectangle, warped but recognizable. "Found this in the rubble," he said. It was the frame of that photo, the glass shattered, the image ash. Mark took it, his hands steady but his heart breaking. The flames hadn't just taken wood. They'd burned a piece of his soul. He didn't sleep that night. At dawn, the lake reeked of smoke and scorched timber. Blackened beams floated in the shallows, the boathouse reduced to a skeleton. Neighbors lingered, whispering about arson and Karen's doing. Mark stood on the dock's remains, staring at the wreckage. He didn't cry, not yet. Instead, he called Rick, his lawyer friend, his voice flat. "She burned it, Rick. My boathouse, my dad's things." Rick was silent for a moment. "You sure you want to keep going? Criminal charges are a different game." "She burned my history," Mark said. "File the motion." Next, he called Travis, who answered on the second ring, voice rough. "She torched my boathouse." Mark said, "You still want to make this right?" Travis paused, then said, "Meet me at the sheriff's station, 30 minutes. Mark drove to town, the charred photo frame on the seat beside him. Sheriff Donnelly, an old high school buddy, met him at the station where Travis was already waiting, pale and jittery. They sat in a small room, a recorder blinking red. Travis spilled everything, Karen bragging about using HOA funds to secure the lakefront, forging deeds with a stolen notary stamp, promising him the cabin if he played along. She never said to burn anything. Travis whispered, "But she told me to make it hard for you to stay." Donnelly scribbled notes. "That's enough for an investigation. Travis, sign an affidavit, and you might avoid charges." Travis nodded, eyes down. Mark watched him, torn between pity and anger. The kid had been used, but he'd still sat on that swing. As Mark left the station, he felt the weight of the day pressing down. The fence, the fire, Travis's confession. It was all building to something bigger, something that would shake Lakeview to its core. He stopped at Lake Hardware, buying tarps to cover the boathouse ruins. He couldn't rebuild yet, but he wouldn't let it sit like a grave. As he hammered a tarp into the ground, Miss Nancy, an 82-year-old neighbor, approached on her walker, her floral coat bright against the ash. "I remember your daddy building that dock," she said. "Let my boys fish off it while he read the paper." She handed Mark a faded photo from 1985. His father, shirtless, grinning by the dock. "Karen can't what's in our hearts," she said, touching his shoulder. Mark's eyes stung, but he nodded. "Thank you, Nancy." That afternoon, he drove to the diner to meet Rick again. Rick slid a folder across the table. "I got the HOA financial records under public access laws. You won't believe this." Mark flipped through the pages. Payments to fake companies, checks to a tanning salon labeled as legal consulting, reimbursements to names that didn't exist. Karen wasn't just stealing cabins. She was funneling HOA dues into her own pockets. Mark's pulse thrummed. "This is fraud, Rick. Big fraud. Felony. Level." Rick agreed. "But we need to move fast. She's already filed a motion to condemn your fence, claiming it's a public hazard. And get this, she's got a restraining order against you. Says you threatened her with a post driver." Mark laughed, cold and bitter. "A fence is aggressive now. She's flailing," Rick said, "but she's dangerous, and there's something else. The county assessor who reaffirmed your deed. He just got a complaint from the HOA saying he was bribed." Mark's blood ran cold. Karen wasn't just fighting him. She was attacking anyone who stood in her way. "She's trying to bury me," he said. Rick nodded. "But you've got shovels of your own." Mark drove back to the cabin, the folder of financial records burning a hole in his bag. He didn't go inside. Instead, he walked to the fence, checking every post, every bolt. The HOA office sat trapped inside, its windows dark, Karen's tulip bed a muddy ruin. Neighbors were gathering again, phones out, recording the spectacle. Mark didn't wave or smile. He just stood there, letting the fence speak for him. As the sun dipped low, he organized a potluck at the community lawn by the HOA office. No permits, no approval, just neighbors and food. Over 60 people showed up. Martha with deviled eggs, John grilling burgers, even Miss Nancy with cornbread. As the crowd laughed and ate, Mark stepped forward, raising a hand. "Neighbors," he said, voice steady, "I wasn't planning to speak, but you deserve to know the truth." He held up the financial records, the forged deeds, the fake invoices. "This is what the HOA been doing with our money, stealing from us, stealing our homes." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen appeared at the office door, shouting, "That's a lie." But Mark kept going, passing out copies. "Look for yourselves, receipts, signatures, fraud." The crowd murmured, then roared. Jeremy, a quiet fisherman, stood. "I voted for her 3 times, but this is theft." Others joined in, voices rising. Fines for birdhouses, threats over hospital stays, towed cars. Karen tried to shout again, but someone shushed her. She ran back inside, slamming the door. Mark watched, his heart pounding but his face calm. The neighbors were awake now, their anger a fire of its own. But as he walked back to the cabin under a clear sky, he saw another glow, orange flickering. He sprinted to the shore. The boathouse fire was still smoldering, but something new caught his eye. A folder, half buried in the ash, labeled HOA Expansion Plan Phase 3. He pulled it out, heart racing. Blueprints of 3 other lake properties marked confiscate. Forged fines under the names of deceased widows. A list of local officials with checkmarks beside them. Mark's hands shook. Karen wasn't just stealing his cabin, she was planning to take the entire lakefront. His home had been a test run. He snapped photos of every page, sent them to Rick and Sheriff Donnelly, then called Janet McBride, a state auditor and his late wife's best friend. "Janet," he said, voice low, "this is bigger than Karen. She's part of a ring." Janet's voice was sharp. "Send me everything. I'll go live in 48 hours. Mark didn't sleep. He moved to Joe's house, leaving the cabin's lights on to fool intruders. From Joe's attic, he watched the live feed from his new security cameras. At 1:42 a.m., 2 hooded figures approached the cabin, one with a crowbar, the other a gas can. Mark's heart stopped, but he'd already called Donnelly. Floodlights blazed, sheriff's cruisers roared in, and the intruders, Karen's boyfriend and a shady contractor, were cuffed before they could swing. Mark exhaled, his hands still trembling. The boathouse was gone, but the cabin stood. And now, with the folder, Travis's testimony, and the arrests, he had Karen cornered. But as he stared at the live feed, a chill ran through him. The knife from the threat note, left on his counter, was gone. Someone had been inside again. Karen's empire was crumbling, but she wasn't done fighting, and Mark knew the final blow was coming. The dawn broke over Flathead Lake, painting the water gold, but Mark Palmer saw only shadows. He stood on the charred remains of his boathouse, the air still thick with the stench of smoke and betrayal. The folder he'd found in the ashes HOA Expansion Plan Phase 3 lay heavy in his hands, its pages detailing Karen Dwyer's scheme to seize lakefront properties, not just his, but those of widows, retirees, anyone who couldn't fight back. Blueprints marked confiscate, forged fines, and a list of local officials with checkmarks beside their names revealed a corruption deeper than Mark had imagined. Karen wasn't just a petty HOA tyrant. She was a cog in a larger machine, one that aimed to swallow Lakeview whole. Mark's cabin stood untouched for now, but the missing knife from his counter gnawed at him. Someone had slipped inside, through a hidden panel he'd found behind the closet, a relic of the cabin's old cellar vent. He'd sealed it shut, installed new locks, and set up security cameras, but the violation lingered like a bruise. The black steel fence he'd built yesterday, stretching from his property to the HOA office, gleamed in the morning light, a barrier against Karen's empire. But it wasn't enough, not yet. He drove to the sheriff's station, the folder tucked in his bag, the charred photo frame from the boathouse on the seat beside him. Sheriff Donnelly met him at the door, his face grim. "Travis signed the affidavit," he said, "confirms everything, Karen's forged deeds, the stolen HOA funds, her orders to make your life hell. We've got her boyfriend and that contractor in custody, too. Arson and breaking and entering." Mark nodded, his jaw tight. "What about the folder, the expansion plan?" Donnelly's eyes darkened. "That's a bomb, Mark. If it's real, it's not just Karen. It's a network. County officials, maybe higher. I'm sending it to the state investigator, but you need to watch your back." Mark handed over the folder's photos, keeping digital copies on his cloud drive. "I'm not stopping," he said, "not until she's done." He called Janet McBride next, the state auditor and investigative journalist who'd promised to go live with the story. "I got your files," she said, her voice sharp. "This isn't just HOA fraud, Mark. The names on that list. County board members, a retired judge. They're tied to a property scheme out of Billings, Lake, front land grabs, fake tax rebates, development contracts. Karen's a pawn, but a dirty one." "How deep does it go?" Mark asked, his voice low. "Deep enough to shake the state." Janet replied, "I'm airing the report tonight nationwide. Send me everything you've got, Travis's statement, the arrests, the folder, and Mark, stay safe. They're not done with you." Mark hung up, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He drove to the cabin, parking at an angle to make it look occupied, then slipped to old Joe's house down the road. From Joe's attic, he watched the live feed from his cameras, waiting. Karen was cornered, her allies cuffed, her secrets exposed. But cornered animals bite hardest, and Mark knew she'd strike again. He didn't wait long. At 10:17 a.m., a black SUV rolled into town, unfamiliar plates gleaming. A man stepped out, all stiff in a black suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He didn't knock or wave. He marched to the HOA office, still trapped inside Mark's fence, and pinned a sign to the door. "Temporary management appointed by state receiver. Lakeview properties under review." The crowd that gathered buzzed with unease. Mark watched from Joe's attic, his stomach twisting. They'd taken down Karen, but now the state was stepping in, and Mark didn't trust clean suits any more than he trusted Karen's blazers. He called Rick, his lawyer, who met him at the cabin an hour later. Rick spread a file across the truck's hood. "The receiver's name is Holt, Governance Compliance Officer from Helena. He's freezing all HOA activity. No permits, no fines, no transfers. Until he ought. It's everything, including your deed." Mark's eyes narrowed. "My deed's airtight, county, approved, court confirmed." Rick nodded. "Holt's claiming he's checking for bias or bribery in the judgment. He's not here to help, Mark. I dug into his background. He used to work for Golden Pine Developments, a firm that turns lake fronts into luxury resorts. Guess who's been eyeing Lakeview?" Mark's blood ran cold. "Karen was working for them, or with them," Rick said. "Holt's not neutral, he's a fixer." Mark's mind flashed to the folder, the expansion plan, the check marks. Karen had been a pawn, but Holt was the knight moving to protect the king. Mark didn't wait for Janet's report. He drove to Lake Hardware, bought more steel panels, and called the fencing crew. The foreman, Carl, raised an eyebrow when Mark handed him a new blueprint. "You're going wider," Carl said. "This'll wrap the HOA office completely." "You sure?" "Dead sure," Mark replied. "Lock them in by sundown." The crew worked fast, drilling posts around the HOA office, enclosing Holt's SUV and the building in a jet-black cage. Neighbors gathered, phones out, some cheering, others whispering. By 3:00 p.m., the fence was complete, the gate locked from Mark's side. Holt stormed out, yanking at the chain link. "Mr. Palmer, this is illegal. You can't obstruct state operations." Mark stepped forward, hands in his pockets. "This is my land, Mr. Holt. Until a court says otherwise, you're a guest in my yard." Holt's face reddened, his voice a hiss. "You'll face charges for this." Mark held up his survey, calm as stone. "I warned you. You came for my cabin, my name. Now you're trapped." The crowd roared, phones recording, and Mark saw the news vans rolling in. The evening broadcast would lead with retired forester fences in HOA headquarters. But before Mark could savor the moment, Travis appeared, holding an envelope. "It's from my mom," he said, voice shaky. "Found it in my car." Inside was a typed letter from Golden Pine Developments, thanking Karen for her transitional property arrangements and promising future talks. Mark's jaw tightened. She was selling us out. Travis nodded, eyes down. "I'll testify to that, too." Mark sent the letter to Janet, who called back within minutes. "This is the final nail," she said. "I'm adding it to the report. Airs at 6. Mark returned to the cabin, checking the cameras. The knife was still missing, and the hidden panel's seal held, but his gut screamed danger. He moved to Joe's again, watching the feed. At 4:32 p.m., a brick crashed through his cabin window, wrapped in a note. "Stop asking questions." Mark's hands balled into fists. He sent the footage to Donnelly, who promised a patrol. Then, at 6:00 p.m., Janet's report aired. Montana Lake HOA corruption ring exposed, stolen homes, forged deeds, and a quiet man who fought back. It showed the forged documents, the boathouse ashes, Travis's testimony, and the Golden Pine letter. The final blow was a leaked email from Holt to Golden Pine, promising clear development rights for a 6-figure bonus. The state receiver was exposed as a fraud. By 7:00 p.m., the governor's office suspended Holt. State police escorted him from the fenced-in HOA office, the gate opening once, then locking behind him. Karen was arrested that morning, her trial set. The HOA board resigned by sunset, their names tainted. Mark stood on his porch, the swing creaking as neighbors approached, carrying hammers, nails, lumber. Without a word, they began rebuilding the boathouse. Miss Nancy handed Mark a restored print of his father's photo, now framed. "This belongs here," she said, pointing to the new boathouse wall. Mark's throat tightened, but he didn't cry, not until the frame was hung, centered, untouched by smoke. The HOA was dissolved, replaced by a lake community council, with Mark elected head. They tore up the fine system, turned the HOA office into a library and youth center, and rewrote the rules for service, not control. The fence stayed, not as a barrier, but a reminder. Weeks later, Travis stopped by, leaving a note and a $1,000 check. "For the tree I cut, the swing I used, the damage I didn't stop." Mark framed it, hanging it beside his father's photo and a new sign. "Respect is the strongest boundary." As Mark sat on the porch, coffee in hand, the lake shimmered under a quiet Sunday sun. The SUV was gone, Holt was gone, Karen was gone. Lake View was theirs again, and no one, not then, not now, not ever, would take it from them.
If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.